Forget everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare, because the events that unfolded in the late 13th century were not just a squabble over borders. This was the deliberate, calculated end of 1,000 years of freedom. This is the cataclysmic, inevitable collision between the most ruthless, calculating military genius England ever produced and a nation that simply refused to kneel. Can you believe a single king could decide to erase an entire culture from the map, not just through battle, but by constructing an impossible, suffocating cage of stone and iron that still stands today? This is the story of Edward I, the man they would eventually call the Hammer, and the desperate, bloody conquest of Wales, a catastrophe no one saw coming with this level of finality. For centuries, the fierce, rain-swept mountains of Wales had been the graveyard of English ambitions. It was a place where kings sent their armies, only to watch them vanish into the fog and the relentless guerrilla warfare of tribal lords who knew every hidden ravine and treacherous path. They called themselves the Cymri, the Companions, and they were bound not by some fleeting political treaty, but by blood, language, and a sacred, unyielding memory of independence dating back to the Roman retreat, a fiery spirit that defied all attempts at assimilation. Their last great hope, the man who had briefly unified the disparate kingdoms, was Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, known reverently as Llewellyn Fawr, Llewellyn the last great prince. He was the true Prince of Wales, a title no English monarch had dared truly dispute for decades, ruling from his stronghold in Gwynedd, staring down the nascent, sprawling power of the Plantagenet dynasty, confident that his mountains offered ultimate protection. But in 1272, a new shadow fell over Europe. Edward Longshanks returned from crusade, not as a pious supplicant, but as a towering, 7-foot-tall engine of strategic, methodical destruction, whose very presence demanded obedience. This was not his father, Henry III, prone to fits and political indecision. Edward I was cold, meticulous, and understood one universal truth of absolute power. It must be total, unquestioned, and publicly demonstrated to the point of terror. He viewed the proud, independent Prince of Wales not as a sovereign peer, but as a direct, unacceptable insult to the crown God had placed upon his own head, a pocket of defiance that must be excised from the map for the sake of English glory. The king's coronation was a spectacle of overwhelming force, a deliberate signal to every rebellious lord, every restless Scot, and especially every proud Welshman, that the time for negotiation was officially over. Compliance or annihilation, there was truly no third path when Edward decided to march. The first tremors of the earthquake weren't felt on the battlefield, but in a catastrophic political snub that magnified Llewellyn's fate tenfold. Edward I had repeatedly demanded Llewellyn come to England to pay homage, a simple act of submission that Llewellyn, secure in his mountains, repeatedly and scornfully refused, missing 6 consecutive summons. This wasn't just stubborn pride. Llewellyn knew that entering Edward's court meant walking into a gilded cage, risking humiliation or permanent imprisonment, sacrificing the dignity of his nation for a fleeting moment of peace. The tension became utterly toxic when Llewellyn decided to solidify his power through marriage to Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of the great English rebel Simon de Montfort, Edward's most hated enemy. Eleanor was a direct, living threat to Edward's carefully manufactured political stability, a symbol of old rebellion, and Edward saw this proposed union not as simple romance, but as a deliberate act of high treason orchestrated by Llewellyn to undermine the crown's authority across the whole island. The situation exploded in a moment of unbelievable medieval scandal in 1275. Eleanor, traveling by ship from France across the English Channel to finally join her fiancé, was intercepted not by rival armies, but by what were essentially state-sanctioned English pirates acting under Edward's direct, terrifying command. Yes, you heard that right. The King of England used literal sea raiders to kidnap the royal bride of a reigning prince. She was snatched off the coast of the Scilly Isles, dragged back to Windsor, and held captive as the ultimate human shield. A direct, unbelievable provocation that shattered any lingering hope of diplomacy. Edward wasn't just demanding homage now. He was demanding total submission, leveraging Llewellyn's love for his betrothed as the sharpest weapon against him, a move of cynical cruelty that shocked even the hardened politics of the 13th century. Llewellyn was left with an impossible, soul-crushing choice. Abandon his fiancée, sacrifice the woman he loved, and retain his nation's honor, or risk everything by defying a king who had just proven he would stop at nothing, not even kidnapping, to enforce his will. By 1277, the slow burn of political maneuvering erupted into the most decisive total war the British Isles had ever witnessed. Edward I wasn't going to send a few regional barons and skirmishers to waste away in the marshes. He mobilized the largest feudal army England had ever seen, a staggering, meticulous force of 15,000 men, meticulously equipped and salaried, operating on a level of logistical perfection unheard of until this moment. This was not a raid. This was an occupation designed for brutal, absolute permanence. Edward's strategy was simple, brutal, and utterly brilliant. Bypass the strong mountain fortresses by marching along the coast, and choke the Welsh supply lines into submission. He didn't need to defeat Llewellyn in a grand, glorious battle in the hills. He just needed to starve the heart of Gwynedd, severing the access to the sea, and seizing the fertile lands of Anglesey, which were the literal breadbasket, the life support system of the Welsh resistance. The sheer, crushing weight of Edward's organization was the true enemy, more terrifying than any English sword. And as the endless columns of men marched west, the ancient prophecy of Welsh freedom was about to collide violently with the industrial, ruthless efficiency of a new kind of empire. The conquest was beginning, and the world was about to change forever. The air was thick, not just with the scent of salt and ancient peat, but with the terrifying, metallic tang of inevitable war. Llewellyn had dared to refuse homage, dared to hold fast to the dream of Cymru Vid, a Wales that would be free. But in doing so, he had unleashed a primal fury unlike anything the island had ever witnessed. King Edward I, towering and unforgiving, did not merely send an army, he mobilized an entire nation, transforming the slow medieval machinery of state into a focused weapon of conquest. This was not a border skirmish for a few stolen sheep or a disputed marshland. This was total war, meticulously planned and funded to the last silver penny. Edward had emptied the treasury, leveraged the power of the church, and called upon every feudal lord from Northumberland to Cornwall, demanding absolute allegiance to this singular, terrifying cause, the total annihilation of Welsh independence. Imagine the scene: 15,000 foot soldiers, a terrifying mix of disciplined English archers, brutal Gascon mercenaries, and hardened knights clad in glittering steel, all converging on the borders. But the real game-changer wasn't the number of swords. It was the relentless logistics that followed them. Hundreds of ships, chartered from the Cinque Ports, churned the Irish Sea, ferrying not only men, but mountains of provisions, thousands of tons of grain, barrels of salted meat, and, crucially, the heavy siege equipment needed to dismantle ancient mountain strongholds, stone by painful stone. Edward understood that fortresses rarely fall to courage alone. They fall to hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of superior engineering. He wasn't just planning a campaign. He was planning a permanent occupation, building supply depots before the first arrow was even loosed, ensuring his army could starve the Welsh into submission while remaining perfectly fed and supplied. But before the massive hammer blow of the main army landed, Edward delivered a sharp, calculated psychological strike designed to cripple Llewellyn's heart: the audacious kidnapping of his fiancée. Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of the legendary rebel Simon de Montfort, was sailing from France, her heart filled with hope for her royal wedding. She was the political glue that legitimized Llewellyn's claim, connecting the Welsh prince to powerful English baronial descent. Edward's agents intercepted her ship off the south coast of England, seizing the unsuspecting bride and dragging her captive to Windsor Castle, turning political strategy into brutal personal theft. It was a move of pure Machiavellian genius, a personal theft that simultaneously robbed Llewellyn of his future queen, his political leverage, and, most devastatingly, his honor. Llewellyn, the Prince of Wales, was now a man mourning his stolen bride and facing an invasion of apocalyptic proportions, with his spirit already fractured.
Edward's strategic genius manifested in 3 terrifying columns designed to choke the life out of the Welsh heartlands. The first, the mighty Northern Army, led by Edward himself, marched straight into the disputed territory of Perfedwad, the Four Cantrefs, the rich, fertile lands east of the Conwy River. This was the economic engine of Llewellyn's power, and Edward meant to seize it immediately, starving the resistance before it could even rally.
The second column, commanded by the ruthless Marcher Lords, men like Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun, who lived and breathed Welsh conflict, slammed into the south, tearing through the defenses of Powys and Ceredigion. They were driven by centuries of blood feud and the promise of rich land grants, turning the war into a gold rush for brutality and accelerating the collapse of Llewellyn's southern alliances. And finally, the third, crucial prong, a massive fleet dominating the sea lanes, allowing English forces to land unopposed on Anglesey, the ancient spiritual home and the breadbasket of North Wales. Anglesey's capture was a death sentence delivered by naval power, a logistical masterpiece that sealed the fate of the rebellion before the first major battle. By holding Anglesey, Edward effectively cut off the crucial grain supply needed to feed Llewellyn's forces and the people sheltering in the mountains of Snowdonia, Gwynedd. Llewellyn's strategy had always rested on his ability to retreat into the rugged, defensive mountains, forcing the English to fight a slow, attritional war in terrain that favored the defender. But Edward had learned the lessons of his ancestors. He bypassed the costly frontal assaults on mountain passes and instead focused on economic strangulation and infrastructure development. The massive industrialized army was now a surgical blade, not a blunt instrument, carefully cutting the veins of Welsh resistance one by one. Llewellyn watched in horror as his control evaporated in weeks, not months. The fertile lowlands, the source of his taxes, his food, and his military recruitment, were swallowed whole by the seemingly endless tide of English soldiers. His great principality, which had once stretched from the Dee to the Typhi, suddenly shrank to the confines of Snowdonia, a desperate island of defiance surrounded by the English surge, trapped and isolated. Edward, I was not simply conquering land, he was building permanence. As his armies advanced, battalions of highly skilled engineers and masons were already moving behind them, laying the foundations for the most ambitious building program medieval Europe had ever seen. These were not simple wooden forts. These were massive, terrifying stone citadels, Beaumaris, Caernarfon, Conwy, designed not only to defend, but to intimidate, a permanent physical statement that English rule was here to stay, carved into the very bedrock of Wales. The iron ring was tightening around Llewellyn ap Grufford. He was trapped, starved, and heartbroken, his ancient prophecy of freedom now drowning beneath the weight of English steel and logistics. The first chapter of the Conquest had closed rapidly, leaving the proud Prince of Wales cornered in his mountain lair, desperately preparing for the final bloody stand against the hammer of the Scots, soon to be known as the Hammer of the Welsh. His only remaining weapon was the desperate, burning loyalty of his people, ready to bleed out on the ancient slopes for the dream of Cymru. Edward did not merely declare war, he declared extinction. The hammer stroke was immediate, deafening, and absolute. While Llewellyn ap Gruffydd clung to the hope that his ancient lineage and the impenetrable mountains would protect him, Edward was already mobilizing a military machine that dwarfed any force seen in British history. This was not a feudal levy designed for seasonal skirmish. This was a professional, state-sponsored annihilation aimed at eradicating the concept of Welsh independence itself. From the deep water ports of Bristol, Chester, and London, the supplies began to flow, a terrifying torrent of iron, timber, and grain, destined for the Welsh marshes. Edward I demanded absolute compliance from his vassals, draining the treasury and calling upon every baron, every knight, and every lowly foot soldier sworn to the crown. The cost was astronomical, a staggering debt that would haunt England for decades. But Edward understood that true, permanent conquest was a price he was more than willing to pay. He amassed arguably the largest army England had ever fielded for a domestic conflict, estimated at over 15,000 men, a staggering figure for the 13th century, where typical armies numbered in the low thousands. Crucially, this force was supported by specialized, devastating troops. Expert engineers were brought in to bridge the treacherous Welsh rivers and breach the natural defenses, while highly disciplined mercenary crossbowmen from Gascony and the Basque country ensured a hail of bolts that no Welsh shield wall could long endure. Edward's presence itself was a psychological weapon. Tall, imposing, and rigid in his belief of divine right, he marched not just as a king, but as a righteous scourge. He did not lead from the back. He was there, overseeing the massive construction of supply camps and forward operating bases, personally directing the logistical nightmare that was feeding and equipping an entire mobile city moving through hostile territory. This was organization on a scale the Welsh princes could scarcely comprehend. The English advance was relentless, methodical, and utterly devoid of mercy. Instead of charging headlong into the narrow, easily defended mountain passes, Llewellyn's specialty, where a few hundred determined men could hold off thousands, Edward opted for strategic strangulation. He did not fight where the Welsh wanted him to fight. He fought how the Welsh could not sustain themselves. The first phase of the campaign, known as the War of 1277, was less a series of battles and more an exercise in overwhelming logistical pressure and coordinated siege. Edward's strategy was brutally simple. Cut Llewellyn off from the sea and starve the heart of Gwynedd into submission. He focused his main thrust down the North Wales coast, securing the crucial lowlands and preventing any resupply routes. The English fleet, mobilized through the power of the Cinque Ports, sailed north and then west, effectively sealing the Menai Strait, the vital waterway that traditionally supplied Llewellyn's principal strongholds, instantly turning the sea from friend to deadly foe. Llewellyn, the last true Prince of Wales, suddenly found himself trapped, his kingdom shrinking with every passing hour. His brothers, whom he had sometimes alienated through his fierce ambition, watched in horror as Edward meticulously peeled away their ancestral lands. Dafydd ap Gruffudd, driven by his own complex blend of resentment and opportunism, made the devastating choice to formally defect to Edward I, a betrayal that tore the core out of Welsh unity.
This wasn't just a loss of manpower. It was a profound moral collapse. Dafydd, who knew every secret pass, every hidden track, and every vulnerability of the Welsh defenses, was now guiding the very hammer coming down on Llywelyn's head. The Prince of Wales was facing external invasion and catastrophic internal treachery, the perfect storm of medieval disaster. His traditional strategy of retreating into the mountains to wait for the harsh Welsh winter to break the invaders failed immediately. Edward was ready for the winter. His engineers began constructing not temporary forts, but the first elements of what would become the Ring of Iron, a series of immense stone-built castles designed not just to defend, but to project English power permanently into the very heart of Wales. Flint and Rhuddlan were the first terrifying manifestations of this plan. Massive structures built at unprecedented speed, symbolizing an occupation that was meant to last for centuries.
These castles were not just military bases. They were sophisticated administrative and commercial centers, designed to introduce English law and English trade, thereby dismantling the traditional Welsh social structure from within. They became self-sufficient anchor points in the newly claimed territory, acting like permanent tumors that Llywelyn lacked the resources or the siege expertise to remove. The hammer was planting nails that could not be pulled out. By July 1277, the scale of Llywelyn's defeat was becoming undeniable. His forces were scattered, his supply lines non-existent, and the vast, fertile agricultural lands he relied upon to feed his people were now under English control. The Welsh had always used the land as their greatest defense. Now Edward was using the land as Llywelyn's prison. The choice was clear: starve or submit. Llywelyn, seeing his people facing famine and his remaining strongholds completely isolated in the mountainous western extremes, made the agonizing decision to sue for peace. The pride of the Prince of Wales was sacrificed on the altar of his people's immediate survival. He sent envoys to Edward, knowing full well that any terms offered by the triumphant English king would be devastating, humiliating, and utterly irreversible. Edward Llewellyn, basking in the glow of a remarkably swift and successful campaign, received the envoys with cold, calculated disdain. He was not interested in mediation. He was interested in unconditional surrender. The resultant Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, was the death certificate of Welsh sovereignty. Tearing up the hard-won terms of the Treaty of Montgomery and stripping Llywelyn of everything he had fought for since the days of his grandfather, Llywelyn the Great. Under Aberconwy,
Llewellyn was allowed to retain the title Prince of Wales, a hollow crown, but his dominion was slashed to the confines of Gwynedd Uch Conwy, the land west of the Conwy River, a tiny, remote pocket of his former kingdom. He became a landholder, not a sovereign ruler. All other lands were immediately forfeit to the English crown, or parceled out to his increasingly influential, increasingly English-aligned rivals. The iron tide had receded, but it left behind a devastated landscape ruled by the invaders.
Llewellyn was forced to pay a ruinous indemnity, and, perhaps most galling, he had to swear fealty to Edward I as his liege lord, a public acknowledgement of his subservience that shattered the myth of the independent Welsh crown. The mighty Llewellyn ap Griffith, who had once held the balance of power across Wales, was now merely a vassal, stripped of his dignity and his power base. Yet, even in this darkest hour, the spark of rebellion, the burning heart of Cymru, refused to be fully extinguished. The treaty was a pause, not a resolution. The hammer had landed, but the final shattering blow had not yet fallen. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in the shadow of annihilation, was never meant to bring peace. It was a gilded cage, a temporary reprieve granted by a predator who was simply resting, digesting the spoils of his first devastating meal. Edward I, the king who smelled blood and saw only blueprints, had already drawn the final lines of the Welsh map, and they did not include a sovereign prince.
Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, stripped of his inherited titles and confined to the rugged isolation of Gwynedd Uch Conwy, understood the game perfectly. He was a king without a court, a prince without provinces, watching his ancient homeland slowly, agonizingly, fall under the relentless administration of the English shires.
Edward's officials moved like termites, establishing English law, enforcing brutal forest regulations, and systematically eroding every vestige of Welsh custom in the conquered Perfedwad. This wasn't merely land appropriation, it was cultural suffocation, a slow, methodical strangulation of the Welsh identity. Every decree, every tax, every English bailiff stationed in a newly erected timber fort was a fresh application of pressure, proving that Edward's victory in 1277 was only the foundation for absolute dominion. The most dangerous and ultimately fateful piece of Edward's administration was the treatment of Dyfed ap Gruffydd, the treacherous brother who had sided with the hammer against his own blood in 1277, was now tasting the bitterness of English gratitude. David, granted meager lands in compensation, quickly realized that Edward viewed him not as an ally, but as a useful pawn, a native curiosity to be patronized and then ignored. He was constantly undermined by arrogant English sheriffs, his ancient rights dismissed, and his grievances mocked. The man who had helped dismantle his brother's kingdom now found himself trapped under the very boot he had helped polish. The seeds of betrayal had been sown deep, but ironically, the bitter harvest was reaped by Edward himself. The simmering resentment boiled over. Dafydd, seeing the extinction of his family's honor and the destruction of his nation's soul, made the terrifying choice: reconciliation with Llewellyn. The brothers, once defined by their bitter, bloody rivalry, were now united by a singular, consuming hatred for the colossal English machine that threatened to swallow them whole. They plotted in secret, gathering the desperate, the dispossessed, and the fiercely independent Welsh lords who refused to bend the knee to the foreign crown. The silence in the mountains of Wales was a lie. It was the taut, strained silence before the inevitable roar. The conspiracy came to a head in the early spring of 1282. The day chosen was March 22nd, the dawn of Holy Week, a time when Edward's forces would be complacent, dispersed, and distracted by religious observance. Dafydd ap Gruffudd launched the opening salvo, a strike of breathtaking ferocity and timing. He led a swift midnight assault against Hawarden Castle, the bastion of English power closest to his lands. It was less a siege and more an execution. They stormed the walls, catching the garrison utterly unaware, seizing the castle in a brutal, chaotic rush. The great prize was Roger de Clifford, Edward's justiciar of Chester, dragged screaming from his bed, wounded, and taken captive. This was not a border skirmish. This was a declaration of total, uncompromising war. Simultaneously, coordinated uprisings flared across the length of Wales. Aberystwyth and Carrickkennen castles were instantly besieged, the English garrisons suddenly finding themselves surrounded by the very people they had been tasked to govern. The spark was struck. The conflagration was immediate. Llewellyn, knowing the utter catastrophe this rebellion would bring, yet unable to stand aside while his country bled, threw his full remaining force into the fray. He descended from Gwynedd to support Dafydd, officially endorsing the rebellion and irrevocably breaking the Treaty of Aberconwy. There was no turning back now. Llewellyn knew that this decision meant either ultimate freedom or absolute annihilation. When the news reached Edward I in England, the reaction was not shock, but grim, terrifying satisfaction. The hammer of the Scots and the scourge of the Welsh had been waiting for this moment.
Llewellyn had provided the legal pretext. Edward could now proceed without political restraint, framing his final assault not as an invasion, but as the justified crushing of treason.
The mobilization that followed dwarfed the massive effort of 1277. Edward I did not just call his feudal levy. He initiated an economic and military effort of unprecedented scale. The war machine began to churn, demanding staggering sums of money, emptied the royal coffers, and called upon every specialist in the realm. This was not a punitive expedition. This was the methodical, state-sponsored attempt to erase Welsh independence from the map of Europe forever.
Thousands upon thousands of infantry, archers, and heavy cavalry were summoned. Edward ordered the construction of vast floating pontoon bridges to cross the Menai Strait, preparing to strike directly into the heart of Llewellyn's last sanctuary, the mountainous island of Anglesey.
The strategic goal was clear: strangle Gwynedd Uach Conwy, destroy its economic base, and bring the full, crushing weight of English logistical superiority to bear. Edward was coming back to Wales, and this time he was not coming for territory. He was coming for the head of the dragon, determined to pay the debt of defiance in fire and iron, ensuring that the Welsh threat would never rise again.
The year was 1277, and the air across England was thick with the scent of impending doom, doom specifically tailored for the mountains of Gwynedd. Edward had moved past fury. He was now operating with the cold precision of a clockmaker designing a death machine. This was not a punitive raid. This was the total, irreversible dismantling of a nation, executed by a king who had learned the hard lesson that half measures only invited future defiance.
The mobilization was unlike anything the British Isles had witnessed since the Norman Conquest. Edward didn't just call up knights and foot soldiers. He summoned the entire economic and logistical apparatus of his kingdom. Every cart, every bushel of grain, every forge was now dedicated to one singular goal: erasing Llewellyn ap Gruffydd from the map of history.
He assembled a fighting force that dwarfed Llewellyn's highest estimates, an army of perhaps 15,000 men, a staggering figure for the medieval period, supported by thousands of pioneers, engineers, and logistical nightmares, all marching toward the Welsh border. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming sound of that advance, the relentless tramp of armored men, the grinding of thousands of wagon wheels, the constant metallic clang of the king's moving supply lines.
Edward knew that the Welsh mountains were not conquered by swords alone. Edward knew that the Welsh mountains were not conquered by swords alone. They were conquered by starvation and construction. He poured immense wealth into securing the supply routes, knowing the critical weakness of every past English invasion was relying on unpredictable local forage. He demanded a constant flow of dried fish, salted meat, and sacks of grain, turning the English marches into a continuous, militarized food factory designed to feed his monster. The Welsh were used to fighting isolated garrisons, relying on attrition, but Edward's operational plan was a masterpiece of suffocating encirclement. He launched a terrifying three-pronged assault. The Earl of Lincoln pushed west from Chester, carving a destructive path through the northern lowlands, systematically securing the Perfedlad, the contested border region. Simultaneously, the forces of the ruthless Marcher Lords, led by seasoned killers like Roger Mortimer, slammed into mid-Wales from Shrewsbury, tightening the noose from the east, ensuring Llewellyn could not retreat inland to the south. But the crucial, terrifying stroke
came from Edward himself, leading the main contingent up the coastal route from Bristol and Gloucester toward Carmarthen, a relentless, professional advance, supported by devastating siege technology and a massive engineering corps ready to build roads where none existed.
And then there was the sea. For the first time, naval power was used not just for transport, but as a weapon of strategic destruction designed to sever the Welsh lifeline. The Cinque Ports fleet, a fearsome armada of war galleys, sailed north, effectively blockading the entire Welsh coastline from Milford Haven to the Dee estuary.
They choked off Llywelyn's access to coastal trade, and most critically, they isolated the breadbasket of Wales, Anglesey, known reverently by the Welsh as Mon Mam Cymru, the mother of Wales, the source of vital grain and livestock necessary to sustain Llywelyn's forces. Edward was cutting off the lungs before he struck the heart.
For Llywelyn, secluded deep in the mountains of Gwynedd, the existential reality of this invasion was a physical, crushing blow. He wasn't fighting the Marcher Lords anymore. He was fighting a king who commanded the centralized resources of half of Europe, backed by bankers from Florence and weaponsmiths from Flanders.
His strategy, always based on rapid, unpredictable guerrilla warfare and relying on the mountains to bleed the invaders dry, was suddenly obsolete against this methodical, iron-clad advance that simply built its way past every natural obstacle.
He watched, horrified, as Edward's engineers began to do the unthinkable. They didn't just garrison existing castles, they began to build entirely new ones, massive stone strongholds designed for centuries of occupation. These were not the hurried palisades of old, but colossal, intimidating fortresses, springing up like dark monuments to English permanence in the very heart of contested Welsh territory.
Flint Castle, an imposing behemoth of concentric design, began its immediate construction, anchoring the northern flank and signaling to every Welsh peasant and prince that the English were here to stay, not just to visit. Rhuddlan followed, cementing the conquest of the coastal strip.
Every mile of newly cut military road, every bridge thrown across a raging river, every tree felled for siege engines was a tangible, crushing realization of the financial and military power he had dared to mock.
Edward was not content with merely winning battles. He intended to win the moral and psychological war, fracturing the fragile Welsh unity Llywelyn had painstakingly constructed. He leveraged the ancient rivalries within Wales itself with surgical precision. He offered titles, gold, and immense tracts of land to Llywelyn's disenfranchised, poisonous brother, David ap Gruffudd, who, blinded by ambition and bitterness over past slights, defected fully to the English cause. Dafydd became Edward's most effective scout and guide through the treacherous interior, leading the heavily armored columns along hidden passes and revealing the weak points of Llywelyn's defense. This was the ultimate betrayal,
the dragon's own kin turning predator, guiding the hammer directly to the dragon's lair. The morale among Llewellyn's remaining followers plummeted. How could they trust the land itself to protect them when the very blood of their ruling house guided the enemy? The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. As the relentless summer campaign of 1277 progressed, the strategy worked exactly as planned. Llewellyn's allies, seeing the overwhelming display of English force and the swiftness of the conquest, began to break ranks and sue for peace. Southern Welsh princes, the lords of Deheubarth and Powys, who had previously sworn fealty to the Prince of Wales in grand ceremony, now rushed to Edward's feet, begging for mercy and English protection, abandoning the concept of unified Welsh sovereignty entirely. By late summer, the siege lines had closed dramatically. Edward's main force had advanced deep into the Perfedwydlad, seizing the crucial coastal route up to the Conwy estuary, the gateway to Gwynedd proper. Llewellyn, who had once ruled vast swathes of Wales, was now confined to the narrow, mountainous stronghold of Gwynedd Conwy, the territory west of the Conwy River. His army was shrinking by the day. His supplies were dwindling due to the naval blockade, and the massive, glittering English army seemed to block every possible retreat route into the wilderness. The Prince of Wales, the glorious figure who had defied 3 English kings, was trapped, surrounded by his own crumbling kingdom.
The vibrant defiance that had defined his reign was now replaced by the grim pallor of siege and starvation. Edward had not yet struck the final fatal blow, but the pressure alone was sufficient to crush the Welsh spirit, forcing Llewellyn toward a devastating and humiliating decision. Edward had achieved in months what previous kings had failed to achieve in decades. He had cornered the dragon, leaving him nowhere left to burn but himself. The stage was set for the crushing Treaty of Aberconwy, but the bitter taste of defeat was already choking the breath from the ancient mountains.
The Treaty of Aberconwy was not a peace accord. It was an execution order for Welsh independence, signed in ink, but dripping with the blood of ancient defiance. Edward I, the meticulous architect of destruction, had cornered the last true Prince of Wales, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, leaving him with only the title and an unbearable weight of shame. He stripped away the Gwent and the crucial 4 cantrefs of Perfedwald, shattering the geographical heartland of Gwynedd, transforming Llewellyn from a regional king into little more than a landlocked vassal who owed homage and fealty to the very monarch who sought his ultimate extinction. This was calculated humiliation, a slow-motion strangulation, designed not merely to contain the Dragon of Wales, but to break its very spirit, forcing it to lick the hand that held the sword. The vast military machine that Edward had mobilized in 1277 did not simply vanish, it transformed into an occupying force, a grinding, permanent presence of English law, English administration, and English steel, pushing relentlessly into the ancient lands. The financial ruin imposed upon Llewellyn was staggering, demanding tribute and reparations that crippled his ability to rebuild or even maintain the semblance of a royal court, ensuring his power withered on the vine while Edward's coffers swelled with the riches of conquest. But amidst the ashes of defeat, there was one flickering candle of personal triumph, a cruel twist of fate that Edward could not completely deny. The marriage of Llewellyn and Eleanor de Montfort, the woman whose kidnapping had initially served as a dramatic casus belli. Edward, surprisingly, permitted the union, perhaps seeing it as a useful leash, a sign of Llewellyn's acceptance of his diminished status, or maybe just a political necessity to satisfy the powerful Montfort faction within his own nobility. The wedding itself, a lavish but deeply melancholic affair, took place in the Grand Cathedral of Worcester, a brief, fragile moment of human connection and joy amid the looming shadow of absolute defeat. Llewellyn finally had his wife, his political pawn turned beloved partner, but the price of that happiness was the complete subjugation of his nation, a debt that haunted every waking hour. Edward, meanwhile, was constructing his legacy in stone and mortar, initiating the terrifying Iron Ring of castles, a chain of impregnable fortresses designed to choke the life out of Welsh resistance forever, locking the Welsh people into a geographical prison. These were not mere defensive structures. They were monuments to conquest, massive, terrifying displays of industrial-scale military architecture, built by thousands of conscripted laborers and funded by the enormous wealth of the English crown, towering over the subjugated valleys. Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, names that would echo through history as the symbols of English domination, each stone laid with the deliberate intent of extinguishing the dream of Welsh freedom, making retreat or rebellion seem utterly futile. Every chimney smoked by an English garrison, every toll levied by an English sheriff, was a razor-sharp reminder to the Welsh that their ancient liberties were gone, replaced by the crushing, efficient weight of Anglo-Norman governance. But the true poison in Llewellyn's court was not the English presence. It was the viper he had nurtured, his own treacherous brother, David ap Gruffydd. David, who had defected to Edward in 1277 and been richly rewarded with lands and titles by the conquering king, was a walking paradox of resentment and misplaced ambition. He believed Edward had not rewarded him enough. The lands he received were paltry compared to the vast domains Edward had retained, and the promises of higher status felt hollow under the scornful gaze of the English barons who surrounded him, constantly reminding him of his inferior Welsh blood. This simmering, boiling anger within Dafydd, fueled by megalomania and a burning hatred for the brother who was still technically Prince of Wales, became the unstable core that would ignite the final devastating inferno of 1282. Edward had attempted to use Dafydd as a convenient tool, a wedge to split Welsh resistance,
but he underestimated the capacity for sheer, chaotic fury that lived inside the younger Gruffydd, a fury that ultimately turned against the hand that fed it. In the darkness of 1282, unable to bear the weight of English condescension and the constant pressure of living as Edward's lapdog, Dafydd made his desperate move, striking first and without warning, shattering the fragile, poisoned peace that had held Wales captive for 5 long years. The target was Hawarden Castle on Palm Sunday, a sudden, brutal attack that saw the English justice Roger de Clifford dragged out and brutally captured, effectively declaring the final doomed war against the unstoppable juggernaut that was Edward I. This was not Llewellyn's war, not initially. It was Dafydd's reckless gamble, a desperate final throw of the dice, that Llewellyn, bound by blood and the cries of his people, could not refuse, forcing him back onto the path of glorious, inevitable destruction. The ancient mountains held their breath. The hammer of the Scots now turned his terrifying, methodical wrath fully and finally upon the last surviving Prince of Wales, determined to erase the very concept of independent Wales from the map of Europe forever.
Edward, I did not just send an army. He deployed an entire economic system aimed at genocide, the systematic dismantling of a nation's soul. When the defiant Welsh uprisings flared back to life in 1282, driven by Dafydd ap Gruffydd's sudden, shocking attacks on the English strongholds, Edward's response was not just fury, but calculated, terrifying precision.
He didn't scream, he planned. He didn't charge, he choked the life out of the mountains, using iron, wood, and debt, ensuring the crown's coffers could outlast the Welsh will to fight by several centuries. This was the moment the hammer truly began to fall, signaling the absolute endgame of Welsh independence. The King of England viewed Llewellyn's defiance not as resistance, but as an annoying, costly logistical problem that required total, brutal elimination through overwhelming industrial force. The year 1282 saw the largest mobilization of resources in the history of medieval Britain, a feat of organization that should have been impossible for the era. Tens of thousands of specialized laborers, engineers, and expert masons flooded the Welsh borders, summoned not primarily to fight, but to build, build, build. Edward was building permanent prisons in the landscape itself, ensuring that even if he left, his authority would remain etched into the mountainous terrain forever. The legendary Iron Ring of castles, Caernarvon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, were not merely defensive fortifications. They were concrete, brutal statements of eternal occupation, designed to withstand siege forever and project English power deep into the most sacred Welsh heartlands, paralyzing the native population with awe and fear. Each looming castle was a monument to the inevitable failure of Welsh independence, a cold stone hand pressing down mercilessly on the ancient spirit of the land. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last true Prince of Wales, suddenly found himself fighting a war he wasn't ready for, dragged into the abyss by the passionate, volatile ambition of his younger brother, Dafydd. While Dafydd's Easter uprising against Hawarden Castle was a glorious, necessary spark of rebellion, it immediately ignited a wildfire that Llewellyn simply did not possess the military or economic resources to contain. The prince knew the gravity of the situation. This was not a skirmish for territory. This was the final, existential struggle against an enemy who played by entirely different rules. An enemy who could always afford another 100 ships and another 1,000 tons of imported limestone.
Edward employed a terrifying three-pronged assault, designed with surgical precision to tear the administrative and agricultural heart out of Gwynedd simultaneously, leaving the Welsh nowhere to retreat or resupply. The main army, under Edward's direct, watchful command, pushed relentlessly from Chester and the north, clearing routes and establishing forward supply bases with a terrifying efficiency that shocked the Welsh guerrilla fighters.
A second, massive force struck deep from the south, aiming to cut off any potential escape or flanking route into the relative safety of mid-Wales, squeezing the territory held by the prince into an ever smaller pocket. Meanwhile, the third and arguably most crucial element was deployed by sea, utilizing the devastating naval superiority Edward had painstakingly cultivated over years. The turbulent sea became a high-speed highway for invasion, completely turning the ancient defensive coastline into the Welsh kingdom's greatest vulnerability. Supplies, massive siege engines, and endless waves of fresh troops poured into the newly built ports, bypassing the difficult, easily defended mountain passes that had historically protected the Welsh heartland from ground invasion. The most audacious, most terrifying move, a true moment of engineering supremacy, was the attempt to breach the Menai Strait, the sacred, turbulent water separating the mainland from the critical food source and refuge of the Isle of Anglesey. Edward ordered the immediate construction of a massive, temporary pontoon bridge made entirely of thousands of coupled boats and heavy timbers, a feat of medieval construction that defied belief. This was an act of profound psychological warfare, as much as military necessity. To bridge the Menai was to violate the deepest geographical sanctity of Wales, proving beyond any doubt that no natural barrier, no matter how revered or how treacherous, could stop the English machine's advance. The Welsh watched, paralyzed and horrified from the mainland cliffs, as the English army literally built a massive road across the water itself, making the impossible a brutal, visible reality. This new, terrifying structure provided a direct, literal, and fast path toward the granary and the cultural heart of Gwynedd, threatening immediate starvation. But even the hammer could miscalculate when blinded by overconfidence, as the English forces, utterly confident in their engineering triumph, began pouring across the partially finished bridge at Moyle Dawn. Llewellyn's desperate men launched a brutal, coordinated counterattack in a perfect storm of timing and ferocity.
hidden Welsh forces, utilizing the high tide and the treacherous, unforgiving currents of the strait, descended upon the bridgehead with savage fury. The English troops, burdened by heavy armor and caught on the shifting, unstable structure of the bridge, were thrown into complete chaos and massacred. Hundreds of English soldiers, including many valuable knights and key commanders, were drowned or brutally cut down. A fleeting, glorious, yet tragically temporary victory for the desperate Welsh defiance. Yet this small, bloody win was merely a moment of respite before the inevitable final storm. It served only to sharpen Edward's focus, turning his cold, strategic determination into incandescent personal rage. He was not merely conquering now. He was exacting brutal vengeance for the blood spilled on those sacred waters. Despite the Moyalladon disaster, the overarching strategic situation remained absolutely grim for Llywelyn. Anglesey, the critical breadbasket that supplied most of Gwynedd, was soon fully occupied by English forces using their overwhelming fleet, ensuring that slow, agonizing starvation would do what swords alone could not accomplish. Llywelyn was now utterly cornered, his armies rapidly dwindling, his already fragile supply lines ruthlessly severed, and his regional authority completely undermined by the relentless geometric advance of the new English castles.
The ancient kingdom of Gwynedd was shrinking daily, compressed brutally between the cold granite walls of the new English Empire and the unforgiving, turbulent sea. The air across the mountains was thick with the dust of destruction and the smell of impending doom, hanging heavy like a shroud. The fate of the last Prince of Wales was no longer about victory. It was solely about survival, and the odds were plummeting faster than the December temperatures in the unforgiving high peaks. Llywelyn ap Griffith had survived the initial crushing tsunami of 1277, but survival came at the price of his soul and his sovereignty. He was a prince in name only, a vassal caged in the unforgiving mountains, his lands whittled down to the barest sliver of Gwynedd proper, forever haunted by the memory of his kidnapped bride and the loss of his brother's trust. This fragile, bitter existence was not peace. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation engineered by an enemy who understood that true conquest was not won simply on the battlefield, but in the treasury, the courts, and the broken spirit of the conquered people. Edward I, the great architect of destruction and iron will, did not simply walk away after his initial triumph. He planted his monstrous flag deep into the heart of Wales, ensuring that the ancient Welsh way of life would be ground into dust under the heel of English governance and law. His strategy was insidious, brilliant, and utterly devastating. The construction of the Iron Ring, a chain of unprecedented, overwhelming military fortresses that acted as permanent, tangible threats. These were not simple, hastily constructed earthen fortifications. These were cathedrals of war, architectural behemoths designed to project terrifying power, systematically suppress the local population, and house permanent, well-supplied English garrisons, ready to strike at a moment's notice against any whisper of rebellion. The psychological impact alone was a weapon more potent than any siege engine. The price tag for this colossal endeavor was astronomical, draining the royal coffers and taxing the kingdom relentlessly. Yet Edward pursued it with manic, singular focus. He knew that stone and mortar, when welded together by genius, were more permanent weapons of oppression than any fleeting army of men, securing his dominance for generations to come.
The man tasked with bringing this nightmare vision to life was the legendary Master James of St. George, a genius engineer whose ambition matched Edward's own tyrannical scope. Imagine the sheer, terrifying scale of Conway Castle, wedged like a monstrous dagger against the estuary, or the impossible geometry of Harlech, perched defiantly on its sheer cliff face, staring down the Irish Sea with cold malice.
These immense, intimidating castles, Carnarvon, Beaumaris, Conwy, were economic engines for the new waves of English settlers Edward encouraged to flood the newly annexed territories. But for the Welsh, they were constant, looming monuments to their total subjugation, the ultimate humiliation. Every massive stone laid was a nail hammered into the coffin of Welsh independence, a permanent, deafening reminder that the Hammer King was here to stay. The crushing terms of the Treaty of Aberconwy had left Llewellyn isolated, forced to pay devastating homage and stripped of almost all his supporting territories outside of the mountainous heartland. Yet, the true danger lay not in the stones of Edward's fortifications, but in the festering, explosive resentment among his own countrymen, who felt abandoned and betrayed by the English king's broken promises of clemency and fair governance. The greatest, most volatile wild card in this deadly political game remained Llewellyn's younger, deeply unpredictable brother, Dafydd ap Griffith. Dafydd, recall, had made the Judas move of siding with Edward in the 1277 conflict, a betrayal initially rewarded by the English king with some small Welsh lordships, a pittance for the scale of his perfidy. But Edward, I was not a man for sharing power, nor was he prone to respecting treaties when expediency demanded otherwise. He treated David with the same cold, calculating contempt he reserved for all lesser, non-English princes, slowly encroaching on the granted lands, ignoring David's fervent pleas for justice, and humiliating him publicly in the English courts. David's fragile loyalty, which had been bought cheaply with paltry promises, quickly curdled into incandescent, murderous rage. This was the predictable, necessary consequence of Edward's monumental arrogance. By squeezing David relentlessly, he created his own most dangerous enemy, turning a vassal into a terrorist. Dafydd, the traitor who had helped shatter Llewellyn's power, was now the one demanding radical, immediate vengeance, seeking to ignite the smoldering embers of rebellion against the Hammer King, regardless of the consequences. His desperation was palpable and infectious. Amidst this tightening noose of stone and treachery, there was a single, desperately needed moment of personal grace: the wedding of Llewellyn and Eleanor de Montfort. After years of captivity and complex political maneuvers, Eleanor was finally released and allowed to marry her beloved prince.
The ceremony, held with bizarre pomp in Worcester Cathedral in 1278, was a fragile, momentary truce in the endless war. Edward himself, the man who had kidnapped the bride and sought the destruction of the groom, even footed some of the bill, a calculated, sickening public display of magnanimity that fooled precisely no one.
Eleanor, the granddaughter of King John and daughter of the great rebel Simon de Montfort, brought a fleeting, crucial hope of legitimacy and, critically, potential English diplomatic connections to the deeply beleaguered Llewellyn. For a short time, they were simply man and wife, momentarily shielded from the political maelstrom that swirled around them.
But that shield was made of tissue paper. Eleanor's presence only highlighted Llewellyn's utter dependence on Edward's chilling whims. The marriage was a political concession, not a foundation for true peace, and tragedy would soon follow.
As the 1280s dawned, the tension became unbearable. Dafydd, pushed to the absolute breaking point by Edward's administrative cruelty and the erosion of his dignity, began plotting the ultimate, desperate act of defiance. The humiliation of the Welsh lords, the imposition of suffocating English law, and the relentless pressure of the castle garrisons had created a volatile mix ready to explode into violence.
Llewellyn, exhausted by years of political maneuvering and the increasing pressure of his limited role, initially resisted the call to arms, knowing the catastrophic odds. He remembered the horror of 1277. He knew the true scale of Edward's relentless, crushing military machine, and the fate that awaited them all. But the ancient cries for freedom were deafening, spurred on by Dafydd's fervent promises of support and the unbearable everyday tyranny of the English bailiffs and officials who treated the Welsh as second-class subjects in their own land. The spark that would ignite the final, devastating war was found not in a royal decree, but in the desperate midnight fury of a betrayed brother. The stage was set for the Second Welsh War, the cataclysm that would forever shatter the independence of Wales and erase its ancient royal lineage. Llewellyn, the last true prince, was about to be dragged into a conflict he could not possibly win, driven by the inescapable fury of his own people and the insatiable, terrifying ambition of the Hammer of the Scots and the Welsh. The quiet years of uneasy truce were over. The iron doors were slamming shut on the last sanctuary of Welsh freedom. The final, brutal battle for the soul of Cymru was merely months away, and this time, Edward I would not stop until the very title of Prince of Wales was eradicated from the history books, buried deep beneath the cold, permanent foundations of his indestructible stone castles.